But first, President Biden is expected to make an announcement Wednesday about student federal loan forgiveness. The plan under consideration by White House officials would cancel up to $10,000 in student loans for people with annual income of less than $125,000. Those who earn above that threshold would not qualify for forgiveness.
I'm JJTP, a lawyer, not your lawyer, and I have a better idea. Now, I'm not a politician, but maybe I should be one. No, that wouldn't work out because on my social media, I'd probably be canceled right out of the blogs. But that doesn't mean, though, I don't have good ideas. So let's talk about one of them. As most people know, student loans have become a major problem in this country. It's over $1 trillion owed by American citizens just for trying to get an education. But what can we do about it? I'll tell you what we can do. First, let's talk about the proposal on the table. You have people like Bernie Sanders who say they want to forgive all student loans. But many people say this is unfair because working class people who didn't go to college would be subsidizing people who did go to college. Then you have people like Elizabeth Warren who say $50,000 is more than enough to forgive. But is it really? When you think about it, when you go to medical school or law school, some of these schools are over $100,000 a year. Even undergraduate in many cases can be over $70,000 a year. So what are you really forgiving? To be clear, it's not the principal we're talking about here, because people agreed to pay those amounts for the school. It's the interest that makes these loans impossible to pay. Because in many cases, while banks are getting loans for 0% or 1%, they're charging poor people, a shadow tax by charging 6.8, 7.8, almost 10% interest in some cases. Consider this. You're an underprivileged person and you want to work in your community as a lawyer. So you go to undergraduate school for $50,000 a year for 4 years. That's $200,000. Then you go to law school, and that law school is $70,000 a year, which is on the low end. That's another $210,000. That's $410,000 you owe before you started a day of work. That $410,000 is not inclusive of any interest that may have accrued over those 7 years. Additionally, if you want to take economics into consideration, it's not inclusive also of any opportunity costs you'd have had to make money for those 7 years. By way of example, if you made only $30,000 for each of those years, you'd have had an additional $210,000 in wealth. And when you add that to the $410,000, you're talking about $620,000 you're really in the hole on day one, not inclusive of the interest. But let's ignore that opportunity cost number and assume that there was no accrued interest. At $410,000, if you took that at only 5%, that means that every year in interest, you're paying $20,500. That's over $1,700 a month before you pay your rent or taxes or anything else. And remember, we're talking about interest only. So if you want to pay this loan back of $410,000 over the course of 10 years, as a rough estimate, what are we talking? $41,000 a year? Again, that's over $3,400 a month, plus the $17,000 for the interest. So now we're talking about $5,100 a month. Who has that kind of money? Just to recap, before you pay your rent, utilities, food, any other expenses, taxes, you have to pay over $61,000 a year. And what most people don't understand, if you work as a nonprofit lawyer, you may actually start your salary at $61,000 a year. Maybe, if you're lucky, you can get to $100,000. But even at $100,000, how do you plan to pay your rent? I know in New York City, in Manhattan, reports have been that rents have gone up to, on average, $5,000 a month. What I'm basically saying is the situation is not tenable. So that brings us to Peepaw POTUS' idea. He wants to forgive a whopping $10,000. Thanks, Peepaw. This brings us back to the classic problem that boomers just don't get it. Sir, yesterday's price is not today's price. Yesterday's tuition is not today's tuition. These boomers come from a world where they can have a part-time job or a summer job that pays for their entire tuition, plus their books, plus savings so they can buy a house. Who has that job? Where is the $50,000 part-time summer job? Sir, again, yesterday's tuition is not today's tuition. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. What you're gonna have is people dropping out of the professional workforce. Why? Because it doesn't make sense to take a job for $100,000 or even $200,000 where you're taxed through the nose and it costs you $600, $700. One doctor, she owes $895,000 in student loans even though she's been paying for the last 28 years. That doesn't make any sense. And you know what makes it make less sense? At least in New York City, there are garbage men with little or no education who make over $300,000. That being said, in this country, we need to make a choice. Do we value education or do we not? Do we want there to be doctors and lawyers to help the poor people, or do we want them all to be working for big corporations where they can make the money to pay back those loans? This brings us back to Peepaw President Biden and his $10,000 proposal. Like I said, I have a better solution, so here it is. So we all agree. Everyone knew how much they borrowed when they borrowed the money. And you know, when you borrow money, you should pay it back. The issue here is the interest. The solution is simple. Roll everyone's loans back to the original amount that they borrowed. Take all the interest payments that they made in the past and apply it to that principal. Then make all future payments at 0% interest. That's fair for everyone. Why? Because you have to pay back what you borrowed, but you're not paying usury rates for interest as a shadow tax for being poor. This is already done in part because some federal loans are already subsidized. By moving to this model, we create a more equitable situation. People who did borrow money have to pay that money back, but they don't have to pay a shadow tax for being poor. People who didn't borrow money don't have to pay to subsidize those people who did borrow money. Does that sound fair to you? Does this sound better than Peepaw POTUS' solution? Let me know in the comments. Like, share, and follow for more content like this, and one day, maybe, vote. So I won't be just JJTP, a lawyer, not your lawyer, but I'll be JJTP, your president.